Welcome very much. It's my pleasure to introduce today to our special guest for Explorers, Tad Sturmer. I hope I'm saying it correctly. On behalf of the International Federation for Public History and the Explorers Project, it's an honor to have you here. We thank you again for accepting our invitation. Today's event is called Show, Don't Tell, the new storytelling paradigm for public history practice, which is a very suggestive name. So I'm going to ask the audience if you have any questions or comments during Taylor's presentation, please drop them in the chat. I'm sure by the end of his talk, we will have an open mic session so you can ask him questions or stuff. But if you cannot wait, just put them in the chat to make sure you don't forget them or anything. Also, sometimes people are a little bit shy when questioned. So if you write them in the chat, I can also read them to them. My name is Jimena Perry. I'm going to be your host, but let me introduce before we start our guest. Taylor Sturmer teaches public history practice as a lecturer in cultural heritage and museum studies at Johns Hopkins University. He is the new film and digital media editor for The Public Historian, and he's currently writing Public History, a field guide for Rowman and Littlefield. Before joining the Hopkins faculty, he was an instructor and GSAS fellow at Harvard, a fellow at Yale, an invited research scholar at Brown, a producer for Disney, and a historian at Colonial Williamsburg. A native of Baltimore and a veteran of the U.S. Army, Taylor is an alumnus of Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Tulane University Law School, and the University of Virginia, where he earned a PhD in history, specializing in Virginia and the American Revolution. He's the author of Colonial Williamsburg, the official guide in 2014, won an Emmy Award in 2013 for Outstanding International Program, very impressive, and was named to Blue Loop's Top 50 Museum Influencers list in 2021. Thank you again for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melon. It's really great to be here with you. It's crazy listening to all of that stuff. It bears the virtue of being true, but it's still weird to sort of hear all of it. And one of the great things that I love about the IFPH and that I love about what you're doing with the Explorers is that it is a new way to it is a new way for us to understand what it is that we do as public historians, but particularly as public history practitioners. It's great that there are people out there who have known me for a very long time. Hi, Claire. And in a number of these guises to actually see this kind of journey, because I think that one of the things that when I talk about a new paradigm, to me, it seems intuitive. It doesn't seem new because it has evolved. To me, what appears to be new about it is how it is something of a departure from what I see a lot of the field doing. Although I don't see that as being a departure from what a lot of the field is talking about, particularly internationally. And especially when we look at the public history projects that are succeeding and the kind of subjects that we want to reach audiences with, that we want to really engage audiences about, that what we are looking for are things that work, are models that are impactful, that things that leave our audiences changed in ways that represent an authentic history, a complete history, as complete as we can get to it, and that make a difference. So it's great to be at this point in the history of public history. 50 years in terms of coherent field, if you trace it back to the Rockefeller grant, in which the field has matured so far beyond history outside the classroom or history of buy-in for the public, that these ways of describing it that are diverse and boisterous, as one public historian has described it, and that's fine, but we have, I think, developed into a much more coherent discipline with its own methodologies, with its own missions, and its own real sense of itself, that we can have more independent, more in-depth discussions about what we do and how we do it, by looking at these wonderful programs that sort of engage outcomes. And so what I wanted to quickly talk about really is just kind of my sort of what it is that I see as being this part of the field, do that briefly, which Hannah gets to hear plenty of already, and my path to it, which Claire has mostly seen. So it's nice to kind of be among friends to do this because I see. Um, that modern public history practice is entirely about audiences. It's entirely about engaging audiences, and that's in terms of the paradigm. That is where we have to start. That it doesn't that that without understanding that that is who we're doing it for. Um, and that might seem a simplistic way to look at it, but with the way that we have so many people are trained, which is about the construction of it, the presentation of it, the promotion of it, the projection of it, that we don't spend anywhere enough time thinking about who is on the receiving end of it. Um, when we flip that around and we talk about being an audience-centered practice, and that everything flows from the nature of engagement, the level of engagement, the purpose of the engagement, then we see it as an art, not a science. That public history practice is an art because it's entirely about engaging audiences, and that art is almost entirely about storytelling. Um, Now we have, as I tell, as we talk a lot in my class, and the way that I learned it, that being a modern public history practitioner means that you are one part historian and you are one part storytelling. That you have to be a good enough historian to be able to tell good history from bad history, and in the sense that you have to understand historiography, you have to understand historical context, you have to understand historical method, because that is the foundation, of all the stories that you're going to tell, of all the stories that you're going to engage in, all the stories you're going to shape. Um, and then you have to be a good enough storyteller to tell good storytelling from bad storytelling, because bad storytelling, you're not going to engage audiences. You have to understand the imperatives of narrative. You have to understand you have to understand the techniques of actually identifying and reaching audiences, so that you can take those stories that you, not just that you want audiences to receive, but that you believe that audiences need to receive, particularly today, um, and that you can do that in a way that you can really understand what the level of your impact is. So you can be so. And to me, the single most effective method of storytelling is visual storytelling. And that's, one of the reasons why the Public Historian, the journal, expanded its editorial staff to include me and created this role, the film and digital media editor, in order to better understand, better explore, better represent how visual storytelling and digital, particularly through digital media, is at the core of reaching audiences and impacting them wherever they are. And that's in a variety of senses. That is geographically, we could be geographically agnostic, but also where they are in terms of what kind of baggage they bring to a subject, where they are conceptually. Um, so that is kind of my view of being a public history practitioner, as being one part storyteller, one part historian, but all of that with an eye towards engaging audiences that you understand, knowing the story that you want to tell, knowing how you're going to tell it, how you're going to engage audiences with it, and being able to follow that through with, in fact, engaging those audiences. We talk a lot about it being based upon co-created meaning and sharing authority, that through audience engagement, by making sure that it's not just presentational, we're not just creating a product and putting it out there and then we're done, that you have to have that public engagement component in order to be willing to co-create the meaning as that comes out of it, to be able to receive what your audience has to say, to be prepared for all kinds of involvement with the subject. And from there, actually understand what the audience is meaning by it. That might be different from what it is that you talked about, to be prepared for that and to be prepared to kind of involve yourself in necessarily. And this has been discussed in a variety of spaces that I think are really valuable. I know that, Dr. Perry, I know that you've been doing this with Explorers, is that how audiences are involved in understanding our own history as it's happening and as we're talking about it. But we need to leave that space for them, that necessary space for them, as a part of our projects, as a part of our storytelling, to make sure that it's an ongoing conversation that help us understand the meaning of what it is that we're trying to talk about. And in terms of sharing authority, that we are not presenting what we think is a complete product, that we are offering up the setting for a long-standing conversation, that and offering up that we can be an authority, but we are not going to be the authority, particularly if we are sharing someone else's story. If we're talking about the story of enslaved Americans, if we're talking about the story of the LGBTQ plus community, is that those authorities have to be shared. And then therefore those meanings can be co-created by your audiences, and therefore all of our projects can be kind of ongoing. And I learned that sort of my path to coming to that is through experience, which is the worst possible teacher, right? It's the best teacher, but it's the worst possible teacher. And that experience was almost entirely at Colonial Williamsburg. I got to Colonial Williamsburg, Claire, at when I was trained, as Dr. Perry mentioned, I was trained as an academic historian. And so I got my PhD at UVA, and I specialized in the American Revolution and within that on Virginia in the American Revolution. And my dream job was to work at Colonial Williamsburg. And I was fortunate enough that right out of graduate school, I had enjoyed a couple of fellowships at CW, and so they hired me right out of graduate school to work on digital history and to also work to basically be the historian for all of their public programs. And in thereby, Colonial Williamsburg made one of the classic mistakes of many institutions today, is in hiring an academic historian, thinking that they can do the work of a public historian. Not true then, not true now. It was a mistake for them now. It's a mistake for lots of institutions now, to assume that an academic historian can do the work of a public historian. Why? One thing: audiences. Academic historians are not trained, must by definition, to work with audiences. Audiences for academic historians that we're trained, where audiences are an abstraction. Audiences, the audience we're engaged with, audience is scholarship, the body of scholarship with which we're engaging, and that our community might be fellow historians who are working in the same field, and we might be in conversation with them in any given moment of scholarship. But our audience as academic historians is a broad abstraction. As my dissertation supervisor told me, he doesn't care if anybody ever read anything he ever wrote. That's not why he does the work that he does. He does it in conversation with the scholarship and the contribution that he's making to the historiography, not for what anybody else might do with it right now. And that, to me, just kind of sums up, what is the main approach of an academic historian. It's the entire way that the methodology is shaped. It's how we're trained. And that is what I got tripped up in when I got to Colonial Williamsburg. That it didn't, it was in trying to go ahead and focus on making sure that essentially I was taking the seminar approach to almost everything that I did in terms of public programming. That this was going to be an opportunity for everybody to learn. That this would be about education, that everybody wanted sort of to be in this basically this grand seminar of discussion about the American Revolution in Virginia in the 1770s. No, they didn't. That kind of didactic way of engaging people, frankly, in a word, to use the technical term, sucked. And I ran into the I ran into the immovable force that has been the single greatest influence in my public history life, which is a guy named Bill Weldon. Um, and that Bill was in charge of the performance end of public programs at the time. And he didn't have much time or use for me at the beginning. And frankly, he was right that he understood early on, having been an interpreter at Colonial Williamsburg. He was Colonial Williamsburg's first Patrick Henry. So he understood living history, he understood first person history, he understood all these different ways of interpreting um, in a way that saw interpretation as how we take this language, this time, this, as Santayana called it, this series of related experiences that we call history, and translating that for audiences. That to him was interpretation. And that first person or in the moment or even costume interpretation are all layers of meaning. And we have to understand there's layers of meaning because if our audiences can learn, that's fine. But it's not enough in public history for the opportunity we had then of what 750,000 people going through there to every year to be able to change them. And it is great to be able to inform them so they're learning something new. But it is a much different thing if we can have them leave changed by the experience and changed to the extent that they want to come back and they want to be changed again. And they're in changing that they grow and they progress. For some reason, I've been reading a lot of George Santayana lately, and this is sort of one of his themes in his 5-volume work on progress, is that this is not about that progress is not necessarily about changing all the time. It's about remembering your lessons and building on those lessons so that progress can continue. And that was very exciting to me. So what I did after a particularly memorable shouting match about this, I shut up. I realized that as an academic historian, I was out of my depth. I was not doing my job, so I shut up. Imagine that quick. I shut up for about 6 months, and I did two things. I did nothing but follow audiences around, whether it was in on tours or on tours of the buildings, or whether it was for public programs with our first person interpreters, or whether it was folks who were walking through the museum, or whether it was folks just walking up and down the street, or whether it was sitting next to them at one of the taverns. That just I just listened. And then the other thing I did was started working with the folks at our film production division and saw how they were working on programs and in producing their own programs. And then I started working with Disney on projects like Pirates of the Caribbean and sort of learning from about audience from that perspective. And so what it really taught me was that um, it is great to inform audiences, but for public history in its own unique way, that is not the handmaiden of academic history, that is not the junior partner of academic history, that it is a powerful tool to make scholarship useful and meaningful and impactful um, in a way that can really change people. Depend if you know who your audience is, and so from then it's really about understanding from audience. Really, the transformation for me is turning audience from the abstraction, which it is for the academic historian, to a clearly defined, coherent group. You know who your audience is. You can practically name them. You know what their demographics are. You know what their psychographics are, because therefore you know what language they speak. You know what preconceptions they bring for whatever story that you want to tell or help telling, for whatever history you want to relate or help represent. that it all comes down to the fact that there's no public in public history. There are many disaggregated, clearly defined publics that we want to attempt to reach. And because if we are trying to talk to everybody, then we are talking to nobody. And that is a clear lesson that I've learned. So the more that we know about exactly the audience that we're trying to reach, then we can have a better idea of how exactly we can reach them, what language they speak almost immediately. I mean, language is always a negotiation. But if we are talking about it, we were talking to because Hannah's here. We're talking to the folks at the Anne Frank House the other day, and talking about their approach with shifting to visual storytelling with their most potent, the most potent resource, which is Anne Frank's diary. That of their approach to turning Anne Frank's diary in order to be able to reach a younger generation. Their target audience was between 8 and 15, who are not reading as much anymore. They aren't reading the diary quite as much. That they're in competition with a lot of other kinds of resources. It's not they have short attention spans; they just have a shorter tolerance for garbage. And so what you need to make sure is that you're doing something that is engaging, but you can't depart from the core your core premise of what you do. And for a site like the Anne Frank House, that is dealing with the most difficult of difficult history. We're going to wade into the middle of Holocaust storytelling, for which you must retain the highest level of integrity in telling the story. And for them to shift to this kind of format, to have a major conceit shift in which Anne does not get a diary for her 13th birthday. She gets a video phone. A leap for 1942, I know, but other than that, every line comes out of the diary, which is why you cannot see this series in the United States. It is so close to the diary that it violates copyright, and the diary is still in copyright in the United States. And so, therefore, if you are outside the United States, you can see the whole thing. But in the United States, the diary is still under copyright, so they cannot show the video because it's entirely lines from the diary. So that they very strictly adhered to the diary, but made sure that their storytelling approach, in order to make Anne relatable to this cohort, which would seem natural. Anne's 13 when they go into hiding. But that they're able to make sure that their storytelling made no sacrifices, took no privileges with the historical record, other than the framing device, literally, of the video diary, and how successful that project has been on a number of levels. That not only did they go into visual storytelling as a way to reach audiences, that this idea that demographics are destiny, that we have to be able to reach these audiences, because the audiences that traditionally go to museums and engage in other project, consume our other kinds of content, that they are departing in a number of ways. But that younger audiences are there and they are hungry for this kind of content. And as long as we are presenting it in a language, and that language can be a visual language that speaks to them for their circumstances, for the way that they consume, not putting it out in 4-hour long documentaries, but in 20-minute clips. That what they did was that they put the diary together. This is an extraordinary project that we can all learn a lot from. So for the journal, we're going to do a case study on it. Is doing it in 20-minute clips. So 12 episodes in one season of 20-minute clips, which, do the math. I mean, that's a couple of feature-length films. And in 3 years, 12 million views in just 3 years. They then produced a series because they had to sort of follow all of these principles that I was just talking about. You had to have this element of engagement to it. For the very first time, the Anne Frank House opened up their content to comments, to active audience engagement. again, because of the nature of the history that they engage in, that this we can all learn from this. Because if they're willing to do it, then anybody should be willing to do this. If they are willing to sort of risk what can come from what a colleague of mine mentioned, bad faith criticism, which is a sort of a weak euphemism for this, but still it works. That if you can, is to open up the comments because they understood that engagement was critical in order to not just reach this audience they wanted to reach, but to keep them and to build on them. This audience, which could be anywhere. Remember, I talked about being geographically agnostic. They could be anywhere. And then you could spark them to come visit and have a different kind of experience. And that is what they have learned has in fact happened. That because they're able to engage on the YouTube videos, because they're able to ask questions and get them answered and sort of learn from each other and create a kind of community around this content, that created a connection with the site. And so many of these folks are now that they are visiting the site. Now they're at what 1.2 million visitors a year. But then it also gives the Anne Frank House yet another way for people who they have to get through the house quickly. For those of you who have been there, it is a close experience. You can point them to this as being an augmentation of that experience. And then they moved on to what is to doing some original scholarship as a result of the meaning that they gained from their audience, about the kind of questions they had about Anne and her family's experience there, and then the experience of the folks who helped them, and then looking at after that the what happened to Anne after the arrest. And they had so much interest in what happened to Anne after the arrest that the museum produced a second season that was entirely based upon that story, and taking that from other forms of visual storytelling that represented the scholarship of what of Anne's experience from her arrest to her death at Bergen-Belsen. And telling this story again, this is wading into the toughest part of history storytelling, that they're able to tell the story of the Holocaust itself through the lens of Anne Frank in a way that it has never been told. And to do it visually is a part of taking of risk. There are very few people who do this well at any level, but they were able to do it. And for in just a year, they've had 3 million views and lots of engagement, with none of it being able to be seen in the United States. It's a tremendous level of engagement and particularly for that audience. So that's just sort of a long-winded way of talking about present examples of understanding who your audience is, what story you need to tell, making sure that visual storytelling is the most effective way of reaching them, but it has to include these elements of engagement in order to, the way we think about it is that turning an invitation into an audience. That if you open up the door to the people who you want to come in, that you have to find a way to keep them there, or to want them to come back. And that is a wonderful example of doing that, of opening up the door to this young audience that they weren't going to reach any other way. And then making sure that the content was engaging enough, but also that they were doing it in a way that was responsible enough to be able to keep them, engage them, help them learn, and then keep them coming back, so that they would in fact then visit the site, and then even after visiting the site, go back and learn more because of the other kind of content it created. That to me is a really wonderful way of looking at how the new paradigm in fact works in practice, and how it's being applied in so many other ways, from National Geographic's A Small Light, which is probably the single best form of narrative history storytelling that I've ever seen. And that just happens to involve the same story of Anne Frank, but from the standpoint of her protectors, of the people who hid them, And then all these wonderful projects that are going on Instagram. There's a wonderful project called His Name Is My Name, which is entirely an Instagram based documentary, done entirely through Instagram posts, which can be as long as 3 minutes, not through stories but through posts. um, that tells the story of a producer who learned that her grandfather had been a Nazi collaborator in the Netherlands during the war. But she produces a documentary through each of these coherent, independent Instagram posts, that has all kinds of engagement, that has all kinds of connection, and it is a public history project. It represents the best of what we're doing, telling stories about the past and the present that matter, that impact audiences and that move them and that keep them engaged and not just inform them, but that help them really be aware of and connect to these audiences in ways that make the past meaningful in the present. Um, and then there is another project that's on Instagram called My Name Is Ava, which follows in a similar fashion to the Anne Frank video diary, similar conceit that a young girl gets a video camera instead of having a diary. She has a video camera, but it's based upon the lived experience of a young woman who grew up in Ukraine, is a young girl during the Holocaust, is captured and is sent to the camps, and it's all done through Instagram stories. Again, with millions of levels of millions of views, and layers of engagement and people who keep coming back and keep asking questions, and all seeing all of that, and that's all happening now. And I think that one of the lessons of that is that it's great to see that happening at places like the Anne Frank House, which is, we can say, is kind of within the field. But so much of the best work is happening outside of the field. And if we have an audience-centered approach, then what we can see, an audience-centered approach that focuses on visual storytelling, we can focus on the work that's being done, the impact that's being had, and then we inside the field can take those lessons and apply it to our own work. I was a little long-winded, but lots of tell but not show. Yeah, I
Well,
know, Claire.
it's 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 really, I mean, you got me thinking a lot, not only about the practice of public history in our field, but also the way we are teaching it. So I'm going to ask you something that I don't know if you can answer or you're working on it, or perhaps you already do. How do you teach someone to be a good storyteller? And I'm sorry, I don't mean to take all the space of the audience asking questions. I open the floor first if there's any questions or comments from the audience first. So while they warm up, can you answer mine?
Yeah, actually, you know what, Hannah, you can end the class now if you can answer that. I'll give you an A today. Um, uh, the way I teach it is, I I make sure that I'm being very, very clear about all that. That from day one, and the way our syllabus is constructed, has to be has to make sure that it is as much a practicum, as it is as it is a subject oriented course, to teach them how to be storytellers. The one thing that I learned when I first started making films, was that your best school is your first project. And so my students get an introduction to modern public history practice and to the main themes in public history practice, but then they start down the road, at the same time, of creating their own project, of going through the process of of identifying the history stories that they want to tell, of shaping that into a story for a visual storytelling project, for turning that um, a treatment, into a shooting script, into production, and then their final product is in fact a film. A 3 to 5 minute, depending upon their project, a 3 to 5 minute micro story. That we then go through that process as we're going through important examples of how history storytelling is working in certain topics, So, and then we have a lot of guest speakers. But like for example, this week we're looking at about at American slavery in public history practice and the different ways in which that story is being told, different the political environment, but all the different methods. We're looking at the 1619 Project and all of its many different forms, and so it is making sure that we are looking at as many examples of history storytelling as possible, of good history storytelling as possible, and that we are. But the key thing to me, and the most important thing to me, is making sure that they are at the same time engaging in the practical end of doing it themselves, but doing it in a way that is guided and doing it in a way that is informed, and that they can see examples of how it actually works and plays out around them. I think you have to kind of balance it as part practicum, sort of part seminar.
Do you use or do you train them to do, for example, oral histories, interviews, the use of testimonies and things like that?
Well, it depends upon what we talk about is what is the evidentiary source base that they're going to use for their project. Because in some cases, and I think this semester it is more, it has happened more frequently, is that a lot of them using interviews, right? That because one of the things that is becoming increasingly clear is the importance of um, opening silences into more recent history and going and being able to engage in and seeing this as a way to engage in original scholarship through visual storytelling, by collecting oral histories, by engaging in in interviews that then find their voice in the visual story. So we're looking at a lot of examples of that, and so it all depends though upon where they are in terms of their of the kind of history they want to tell. I have one student who's working on a project in the 1680s in Pennsylvania about religious freedom, and so oral history is not an option. But what we have but the one thing that we talk about a great deal is how do we make sure that you're telling a story that matters, that it's important to tell stories that fill in gaps and that inform our audiences, but that the best kind of stories are the stories of impact. And in that case, what we want to do is we want to fill in silences. And for that, a lot of that is about go where we go for oral history and where we go for much more active kinds of scholarship that they know that visual storytelling can in fact represent original scholarship and can actually make a contribution to our understanding that the historiography hasn't reached. And so it's really sort of make more of a recognition about being very clear about what your evidentiary options are, and if it's not there, then you need to go fill it.
We have a question from Claire. Perhaps a simplistic question, I don't think so, but within the importance of knowing one's audience, how much should a public historian customize their storytelling?
Yeah, Claire, absolutely. As it should be as customized as possible. That it really needs to. If your audience is broad, then it depends. But it's interesting, when we and you and I have had conversations a little bit along this line, but that it is so interesting when we think about language and communications choices as a negotiation from the beginning. That the minute that we decide that we're going to use English, we've made a choice, right? We've made a choice about that audience. The minute that we've decided that we're going to pitch it to this level in terms of vocabulary and terminology, we're making choices. Now, for a lot of public historians, those are not conscious decisions; those are just assumptions. Whereas you don't make what we try to do and what I try to help my students understand is that who do you exclude with the choices that you make in the elements that you deploy. So again, so if you're going to choose English as your language, okay, you need to know who you're excluding. If you are using so if you want to customize it to, if you know that your audience is 8 to 15, then you should have an idea about the kind of language that you have no business using, because you want, not because you want to streamline it, not because you want to dumb it down, but because you want it to be effective. You want it to actually be literally on their terms. And if you're talking to if you're talking to audiences of color, if you're talking to audiences of other kinds of ethnic backgrounds or other kinds of religious backgrounds, then that's why you cannot understand your audience enough, because that enables you to tailor that, to customize it, to use your word, to customize it as much as possible. Because the more you're able to customize it, then the more they're able to understand it, the more they're able to get. So the less work that you have to do in terms of exposition and things like that to actually get into the heart of the story, and therefore the more engagement you're going to get back. So you can, with that audience, move on to the next story. You can have more of a conversation when you're not tripping over a language. And that's why I'm a big fan of what's called narrowcasting, right? We know what broadcasting means, but narrowcasting and making sure, and this is what the brilliance of digital media is now, is that we can target our messages, our stories to those audiences, and customize them within an inch of their lives. Why? Because we really want them to be understood. It's one of the things, and obviously Claire and I know each other, so there's one thing that I do want to say about this. Why there are a lot of things that we did at Colonial Williamsburg, that, in my view of it then and there, and my view of it used at other institutions, things like costume interpretation, things like first person interpretation, in which you are reaching for other languages, both in clothing's a language, and reaching for other languages in terms of 18th century language, or what you think of 17th century language, is that is not thinking enough about who you're excluding from the education from the message, the story that you're trying to tell. That it might be more distancing now than we thought, and that those kind of tools that are automatically not customized, right, but they are distanced, that we need to be much more careful about the deployment of those, because they seem now to be more distancing for audiences than things that bring them in because they're interesting. I'm not saying that we get rid of it, but I'm just saying that we need to have a better understanding of it as a tool, because our main goal should be making sure that we're being understood by our audiences in the ways that we want to be understood, and in a way that will elicit and spark and inspire engagement back on our audience's own terms. And that, to me, is what is so exciting about it.
I think this was a very important question. Well, at least it was for me, because you have opened my eyes, like thinking when we think about public history in general, we think, okay, we need to get to broader audiences to get historical knowledge to beyond academia, but we never like like a general mass. And you're saying, no, you have to know your audiences. They're different kinds of audiences. They have to be tailored for that. And I think that's a very important point that many public historians should have in mind. So this has been like very enlightening for me. Is there any questions or comments from the audience, from this audience? Michelle.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Ted, you are contagious with your smile and knowledge. Thank you so much. I have two questions for you. How do public history, cultural heritage, museum, and digital media intersect and influence on another?
Oh,
Two questions.
that's a great question.
What is the main message you're bringing on your book for historians? Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, my main message is that you have to pay attention to audiences. You have to stop paying attention to yourself. That if what you're doing isn't for somebody else, then get over it. That our goals right now really need to be about if there are a lot of people who talk about, well, history needs to matter. And I'm all in favor of that. But it can't matter just simply as a fact of the statement. That it matters by how we engage with other people and have them understand that it has a role and a place in their lives. This is about understanding this is the way I always talk about it, that it is about understanding how we got from then to now, and in the now, understanding how we in fact relate to one another, how our relationships came to be in reality. What is the historical background of that, so that we understand the world as it is, and in doing that, we can then have an authentic approach to the world as that might be. We can in fact solve those problems rather than engaging in kind of this recitation of mythologies that people count as identity, and that get in the way of us actually seeing the problems that in fact do exist, because of how we got from then to now. And that is the role of the historian. That is the role, particularly the role of the public historian. We have an active, being a public historian is not a passive role. This is an active responsibility to actually be in the middle of this, and to facilitate this understanding of how we got to where we are, for history to be meaningful and intelligible. And that's where I see the intersection, that you mentioned in your first question, of museum studies. Museums are places for people to come to understand these things, for them to sort of commune with the past and with artifacts and with the culture. And digital media to me is just a wonderful way to deploy those messages. It's great. It's our most potent tool in our toolkit, of being able to connect with those individual audiences. And in doing that, we then can just create this force for good, that I am happy to proselytize for. So there are fewer, frankly, Michelle. So there are fewer people who look and walk and talk like me, who are doing this stuff.
We have another question from Acadia. I hope you're saying your name right, Acadia Roher. Given the discussion on Anne Frank, have you been through the VR Anne Frank house, and do you have thoughts on that method's effectiveness as a public history tool?
Yeah, I have been through. Thank you, Acadia. I have been through it. And you know what? I'm going to tell you, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think I am a big, yeah, I'm a big fan of tech, obviously. I think there's so much that it can do, but it's a little bit like what I was talking about, at least to me, this is just my personal opinion about it. Is there is a bit of distancing to it, right? There is a bit of unreality to it. You know, that like watching somebody in historical clothing that's really clean, that's really pretty and just kind of beautiful and not dirty. Um, that that the It was interesting talking to the folks at the Anne Frank House about how much they learned by having to build the set for their video series, and how, that in building the set, because they obviously couldn't film in the original location, but they built the set to be as the closest possible replica of what the annex looked like. Um, but because you're able to, in fact, in the set, enter into those moments and all of its messiness and all of its, cloistered and closed impression, that you're not really, that you were able to, they said that they were able to get so much closer to the lived experience event by going into a set of it than by doing something like the VR. The VR can help, to kind of orient you, but it doesn't immerse you. And to me, immersion, like, I don't know if any of you have been to the Dennis Seavers house in London, which to me is just one of the wonderful experiments in immersion in the world. But you get so much more out of being able to understand, and we talk about this a lot in public history, right? The importance of space, that there's no substitute for being there, and that I think that VR really has, I think really has limits. It can give you an idea of spatial relationships, but, I think its utility is limited. I hope that answers your question.
Anybody has another observation or comment? I have not a, oh, Hannah, you turn on your camera. Do you have something to say? We can't hear you. Maybe you can write it down. Maybe you can write it down if you don't mind. I can read it.
Talk about somebody who's got a great project. Hannah has a wonderful project that she's working on for our class right now. So she can tell you about becoming a history storyteller. She's doing some great stuff.
I'm trying to unmute you now. No? I said I unmuted you. Ask to unmute. Okay. Now, from my end, you're unmuted. I don't know. I'm sorry. Yeah, but while Hannah writes it down, I want just to make a comment of something I was discussing precisely with Michelle this morning. It's about like the different ways to do public history around the world. We are both doing public history in Latin America. And the way we do public history in Latin America is quite different from the one done here in the United States and in Europe. And I think those differences are also very interesting and also I mean, the audiences are also very, very different. For example, in Latin America, we're talking about a much more politically committed way of doing public history. However, the way you're talking about it right now, Taylor, it's very similar because you have to be very committed in an ethically and political way with your audience to be able to convey your message.
I think you're right, and Michelle, I'm familiar with your work. That the idea that public history is an active tool. That this is something that isn't just. I don't understand why. Yeah, I think I do understand why. I think that because of the junior partner role that public history has played in the United States for so long to academic history, that it has kept it from assuming a similar role. This active role that it has to tell these stories, that it has to have a point of view, it has to have a perspective. It can be an active partner to making things better by helping us understand. And that's so much of what you're doing in Latin America. And I would like to see more of that approach in the United States, rather than where it's been. And I think it's got to go in that direction.
I think, Hannah, can you try speaking? No? I'm sorry. I even made you co-host to see if you could speak. I don't know if this is on my end. I'm so sorry. I'm going to read Hannah's intervention. As a student of Taylor's, I want to say that the methods of teaching public history I found really effective that he uses are the practicum elements and also tying it to what's happening in real time. We are constantly working with current events in class that really tie the concepts into active practice. Lots of classes I take have been very theory filled. Sorry about the mic issues. No, I think that's my fault, the mic issues. Okay. Taylor, something you have to say about Hannah's praise of your classes?
I told her she'd get an A, but she's already getting an A, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure what more I can do for you, Hannah. Other than to sort of praise the work that she's doing. I think that if that what's wonderful about making it very clear that this is how we're going to learn it, and it ends up having pitfalls when we want to stay in the moment, right? When we really want to engage with issues as they're happening. And again, this is a little bit like what I think this is a little bit like more of the approach of Latin America, that this isn't talking about discrete subjects that are past that we have to somehow drag into relevance into the present, that we are talking about things that matter right now, and how we engage in them, and that there in fact is an organic way, not a constructed way. There's an organic way in which we fit into those discussions. We can presume too much, and we need to be careful about that. But if we stay in our lane can be a fast one. And I think that that's something that's exciting. And one of the things that I love about teaching this class, and particularly this semester, is that it's always a team effort, right? They're talking about shared authority. I'm just there to kind of facilitate. By having students be engaged in the process of creating this meaning as we go too, by bringing what they know and what they understand about what's going on around them, I think is terrific. And I'm not even an old Abe, so
Can
that's
you tell
her
us?
project.
Oh, can you tell us about Hannah's project a little bit more now that you mentioned it? Now everybody's curious.
It's really too bad that she can't tell you about the project. I just read her shooting script this morning. I hope my notes made sense, by the way. But she is doing it is we always talk about in storytelling about finding the finding the macro and the micro, and vice versa. And and Hannah
Testing,
is
testing. Is it
hey,
working?
We
there
can
you
hear
are.
you.
You
We
can tell
can
us
hear
about your
you.
project.
Okay,
Okay.
go.
So
Hooray!
can you hear me? Is it
Yes.
okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I am living in my hometown of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And in high school, our mascot was something called an Old Abe, which caused a lot of confusion to literally any other school that came to us. But we were named after an eagle that fought in the Civil War with a volunteer regiment from my city. And so kind of using that hook of the fact that I'm an old Abe, but that's kind of nonsensical. What does it mean? My project goes back and tells the story of how this eagle ended up in the Civil War and then became a prominent symbol of my city and my state. And then still 160 years later, you have old Abes in Eau Claire.
I have a question for you, Hannah. What does this project, how do you make it an engaging project?
Oh, that's a good question.
I want to hear this one.
Something that I really focused on when I was writing my script, because I wanted to write something for people in like late teens, early 20s. So I focused on trying to find a balance in the language of having enough information that you get the context of the story and the narrative, but without getting too says reading a lot about different machinations in in army units and that sort of thing, but making sure the language is accessible, and that finding ways of keeping it moving and not losing which is something I'm still looking to balance as I'm showing.
Yeah, Hannah's got a really great grasp of her audience, and it was a really big and that was a really big in terms of the development choices of her figuring out exactly who she's speaking to, and that gets us to sort of to Claire's point about it. She really has customized her story to that audience in order to make sure that okay, well, what really is the meaning for that audience, and what is the potential meanings it could have to that audience. So she's been very clear about who she's speaking to and then how those choices inform the story. It's great to read the script, and it really does reflect that.
Because it also makes me think a lot about language. I'm going to talk about my experience just being here, the coordinator of Explorers, and also in my own work. I struggle a lot with that because I'm also trained as an academic historian. So of course I use a lot of big words. I use a lot of big words, but those big words are I understand them and that's it. And that's not the idea for a public historian. So in trying not to use them, it's a struggle. It's supposed to be easy, but it's not. So that's something that's always in tension that I find very interesting. So I like that example. Go ahead, Anna.
Actually, I'm sorry. Hannah and I have to go.
Yeah. I was just gonna say I used to work with kids, and so that helped a lot because it was explaining concepts that are very technical to an audience that doesn't need to know the nitty-gritty of it to understand
it. Is there any other question or last comment for our presenter? Okay, if not, I just want to thank you very much, Taylor, for this presentation. I hope it's not the last one. Hannah, also thank you. Perhaps you can be also a guest for Explorers and talk about your project in the future. In the future, it doesn't have to be tomorrow. It can be sometime in the future. For my followers, Explorers is going to be on a vacation in August, so we will come back in September. So stay tuned, and thank you very much for being here. I'm going to stop the recording now.